A quick word from Vijay Prashad.
Over the last 2 or so decades, there's been an increase in thinking among the left, liberals, intellectuals, in the direction of so-called spontaneity. In other words, that uprisings happen spontaneously. People are frustrated, angry, and then they spontaneously rise up. And what they don't require is preparation, or what we used to call leadership. Leadership is another word for preparation. In other words, in times when the tempo for struggle is not very high, you prepare populations by conducting acts of courage building, confidence building, respect for each other. That's what the preparation is about, and it requires leadership. So this aspect of political struggle or leadership or preparation has been largely denigrated. I consider this a kind of neoliberalism of the left, this rise of the promotion of spontaneity above preparation. And of course, I understand politically that uprisings take place as a combination of spontaneity and preparation. Not that preparation is more important than spontaneity. But in this period of the neoliberalism of the left, spontaneity has, in a sense, overshadowed preparation. Whether it's Black Lives Matter or Occupy, in the American political discussion, there's a tendency to assume that people sort of arrive politically. There are these gatherings and there's no agenda, there's no leadership. This is always an assumption in the media, and then they browbeat saying, where are the leaders? Why don't they have an agenda? Well, actually, underneath each of these, let's say Occupy or Black Lives Matter, there are networks. There is this infrastructure of confidence building. There are organizers who are involved. Many of them have been organizers for decades and have great experience in knowing how to build a movement. And so there is, again, in the media, a writing out of this very crucial work that gets done to produce a movement. If you look at the leadership of Black Lives Matter, they didn't come from nowhere. They came from queer movements, they came from feminist movements, they came from socialist traditions. They come from a wide variety of confidence building dynamics. And so I think that this argument we are making, I think, is a bigger critique of the kind of neoliberalism of the left.
Welcome again, listeners, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. Ken, how are you doing today?
Oh, just great. Enjoying another lovely day of the pandemic. How are you, Andrew?
Well, I am surviving, and that is quite a good thing. Today we are speaking with Marcie Smith. She is a professor of economics. She has written this really important, in-depth article about Gene Sharp, a very interesting figure in both the history of the national security state and protest politics on the American left. The reason why I think Marcie's work needs attention is because her recent scholarship on the late Gene Sharp, a guru of nonviolent direct action protest activism on the left, is especially relevant because of how many radicals like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, Occupy Wall Street, environmentalists affiliated with both the Democrats and the Green Party, and many other formations in the headlines today have been practitioners of Sharp's politics.
Yeah, and given how interesting Marcie is, let's get straight to it.
So, Marcie Smith, welcome to the Washington Babylon podcast. You have been writing now for several years, it seems, about Gene Sharp, this leading figure in left and academic intellectual discourse around philosophy of nonviolence that's become pretty, I guess we could almost call hegemonic within the activist left and progressive circles over the past 20 years to 40 years maybe. And I wanted to start off because it's very obvious reading the second part of your article what your experience was, what parts you feel comfortable talking about with Sharpism and how it's led you to this point.
And if I could just intervene for a second, please start by telling us a little bit more about Sharp and how you became interested in this character.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you both for having me on. So Gene Sharp, he is understood or typically is understood as this sort of intellectual giant of nonviolent protest movements around the world. And if you Google him and look at the mainstream profiles and reporting about him, he's typically cast as this sort of lonely prophet of peace, who has been this sort of crucial friend to popular movements and left movements, since the 1970s. He had a very long and prolific career, passed away in January 2018. But my argument is that if you actually look at his entire career, a much more, honestly, interesting picture emerges. He's better understood, I think, as one of the most important U.S. defense intellectuals of the Cold War, and was connectedly an early kind of neoliberal theorist of the state concerned with the supposedly inherent violence of the quote-unquote centralized state. And he's expounding on these ideas and putting them into practice with, nonviolent action training right at the moment of the neoliberal turn and the collapse of communism. And he's very active, his organization, the Albert Einstein Institution, is very active training secessionist movements in, the countries seceding from the USSR in the 90s. And so he's, I think, a really important world historical figure in terms of understanding how U.S. foreign policy has been advanced. I think people often think of protest as somehow kind of a sacrosanct, means of political action that only progressive and left-wing, and authentic grassroots movements use. But part of what I'm trying to show here in my work is that just like, voting or lobbying or any other political means, protest is something that can be harnessed and deployed by empire as well, or by any force, really. And to your question, how I became interested, I myself, was involved in U.S. social movements pretty intensely from about 2007, 2006, until about 2017, and most intensely the U.S. climate movement. And it wasn't really until I moved up to New York City and I was working for a nonprofit and was sort of seeing how social movement strategy was being developed, from sort of that perspective, that I realized how important this character Sharp and some of his kind of followers, people like George Lakey, how important their ideas are in social movements broadly, but certainly was the case in the climate movement, which made me curious. I want to make sure the ideas that our social movements are using are good and sound. And there were a few just kind of curious things about Sharp's program and his, the strategy that he offered that didn't strike me as, necessarily 100% consistent with my own politics. And so it prompted me to read more and search deeper, and, sort of like pulling a piece of yarn on a sweater, the more I researched, the more sort of fascinating the story became. And I think the implications, are, as I've been told by many of my colleagues and fellow activists, they're pretty challenging implications, I think.
Well, how can we understand the gap or explain the gap between his image and as you say, as you write in your piece, you say that he's been compared to Gandhi. The Atlantic wrote that besides Gandhi, no one in the last century has more systematically laid out the theory of nonviolent power than Sharp. And yet you say that, and as you've been suggesting here, he had all sorts of government funding, and you say he was no peacenik, wilderness wandering prophet, but one of the most important U.S. defense intellectuals of the latter 20th century. So how many peaceniks were aware of his complexity? Was he deliberately hiding his ties to the U.S. defense establishment? How is it that this legend grew up around him without anyone being aware of it?
It's a really good question, and I think I don't have I don't have a definite answer, but from my research, my suspicion is that while he did not actively hide his associations, there's a way in which a certain narrative took hold, especially in the 90s and then 2000s, back when the public consensus was very favorable to pro-democracy regime change operations. Very few people were challenging the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic. Very few people still do, right? That was sort of
right.
Could make you a persona non grata. So I think that his association with his organization's association with the collapse of the USSR and with the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic and other color revolutions, he benefited from the fact that history was casting all of those historical events in very rosy terms. So his story necessarily also assumed a very rosy cast. But I think it is interesting that, part of the issue could be that critiques of Sharp up to this point have sometimes ventured into the realm of just kind of outright conspiracy theory, and I thought it was very important in my piece to be very rigorous and to deal with all the contradictions. You use the word complexity, and I think Sharp was a really complex character who does not, deserve to be dismissed, but far from it. I mean, he deserves to be studied and understood as a really important world historical political figure who really, his ideas shaped history. And ironically, I mean, his supporters and I agree on that. They don't like the complexity that I'm revealing, but I think that is necessary to really fully grasp what has been happening in the world for the past 40 years. So that's my sort of tentative answer. A lot of this has turned into, strategic nonviolence and Sharp's politics of nonviolent action, revolutionary nonviolence, which is the sort of ideology in which this strategy is embedded. These are ideologies, and people have strong attachments to ideologies. People build careers around ideologies, and there's a sort of just the inertia of once a certain worldview and strategy has taken hold, there's going to be resistance to interrupting it. So I think all of that explain why up until now there's not been a more thorough treatment of, as you say, Sharp's complexity.
So one of the things that I really appreciated about your piece was you talk about in the second part how there's been this evangelism of his praxis across not just America, and it's showing up in things like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too formations. I'm affiliated with the Providence chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice, and they've been trained in it, Dandelion Rebellion, but also things like in Venezuela. And I was wondering if you could talk about its impact on the global South over the last 20 years.
Sure. Just to give some kind of background context for listeners who haven't, read the full piece. So I've mentioned that Sharp was an important U.S. Cold War defense intellectual. So part of the reason I say that is because one of his kind of defining affiliations, which is very, very, very rarely mentioned in any mainstream article about him, is that he spent 30 years at this place called the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, or the CIA at Harvard, as it was sort of cheekily called when it was founded in 1958. And as I say in the article, this institute is a major node in this emerging post-war national security state that's really, focused on this emerging Cold War context. And the center's priorities focused on defense-related questions like understanding, quote, the role and control of force. And as part of this, they are in fact interested in peace research. And the Department of Defense is funding peace research. And Gene Sharp is a young man who is at the time studying for his PhD at Oxford and has been in Norway at the University of Oslo researching nonviolent resistance to Nazi Germany. And while in Norway, is introduced to this very important economist and nuclear theorist, this guy named Thomas Schelling, who, is not as famous as somebody like Dean Rusk or McGeorge Bundy, but was a major Cold Warrior. The New York Times or the Washington Post, I believe, described him as the man who made the Cold War what it was. So he's a major insider, Marshall Plan, kind of core staff, an advisor to Truman. And Schelling is really impressed with Sharp's research on nonviolent action and recruits him to the CIA at Harvard not long after it opens. And Sharp agrees, and he goes to the CIA at Harvard, and he spends 30 years there. And the scene it's been described as an incubator of presidential advisors. It was founded by McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk. They actually founded at the invitation of the Ford Foundation. Its first co-directors were, when Sharp joined, the co-directors were Henry Kissinger, whom we all know, and Robert Bowie, who is going to go on to become deputy director of the CIA. And you can just go down the list of resident intellectuals, and it's top flight Cold Warriors, people like Zygmunt Brzezinski, Alex Inkelkes, Seymour Martin Lipset, on and on and on. And so this is a kind of explicitly ideological defense think tank that has access to the kind of highest echelons of power, and there's a kind of rotating door with defense, intelligence, and political, official decision makers and decision making. Sharp is there for 30 years, and he himself is undertaking his research with Department of Defense related funds or Department of Defense funds. He's participating in things like the Harvard-MIT Joint Arms Control Seminar, which is this very kind of elite discussion group that was convened by Kissinger and Bundy and Schelling and Bowie and all of the kind of these core Cold Warriors. So he's there for 30 years, and then in the early 80s, he takes all of the ideas that he has been developing within the auspices of the CIA at Harvard, which really, in a word, are his big idea is that nonviolent action is a kind of weapon, a kind of amoral weapon that can be, the kind of mechanics can be studied and used by anyone. And so he offers this kind of, at least facially, apolitical or non-ideological systematization of nonviolent protest. And he writes this big 3-part magnum opus, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, in 1973. And he's doing this, and it's very clear, he's doing this, he's writing this, for a very broad audience, but one that very importantly includes the U.S. defense community. Because, by all accounts and by all evidence, he agrees with the fundamentals of the Cold War. He just wants it to, as much as possible, be advanced nonviolently. And so in the early 80s, right around the time, Reagan is elected, the National Endowment for Democracy is founded, he starts something called the Albert Einstein Institution with this guy, Peter Ackerman, who is a total character. He himself was, at the time, working a day job as the right-hand man to Michael Milken of Drexel Burnham Lambert and the big junk bonds scam. And Ackerman is, that kind of reveals something important about Sharp's politics. Ackerman is a big libertarian. He, goes on to sit on the boards of things like the Project for Social Security Choice, run by the Cato Institute. They want to privatize Social Security. And Albert Einstein Institution then starts training protest movements and nonviolent pro-democracy, quote-unquote, dissidents around the world, starting not actually in what we understand to be the global south necessarily, but really focusing a lot of attention initially on the kind of decaying communist world. And then they've got another major success in the overthrow of Milosevic in Yugoslavia. Very famously, there has been, quite a bit of reporting on this, but AEI trained the activists of Otpor, the youth movement that was targeting Milosevic in 2000. And, Sharp's Politics of Nonviolent Action managed to do what, air raids couldn't. They were crucial. They were decisive in overthrowing Milosevic. And then we do see, we see efforts, Sharp and AEI are active throughout the world in this time. They, are training activists from China, from Burma, and I go into this more in part one. You can look at the list of all the countries that AEI itself reports that it did training for or in, and it aligns very tightly with U.S. State Department foreign policy. Where are we trying to resist communist or quasi-communist. Sharp and AEI very predictably sort of show up in those contexts. And meanwhile, U.S. client states like Saudi Arabia that also unambiguously are in the thrall of dictators remain kind of unharassed and unbothered. So fast forward to more recent times, the story of Venezuela is very important. It's kind of a turning point. In 2003, there's a failed military coup that had, according to the Times, been quote unquote blessed by Washington. And in the wake of this military coup, the Albert Einstein Institution sends one of their kind of key staffers or key consultants, Colonel Robert Helvey, who himself had a very long and illustrious career as part of kind of defense intelligence. They send him to Caracas to spend, over a week consulting with these anti-Chavez activists. And despite the agitation of these activists, who do manage to Chavez wins in a landslide in 2004, despite the military coup effort. The activists that have been trained by Sharp are among those leading campaigns to call for a recall, which is granted, and again, Chavez wins. So AEI starts getting thwarted in Venezuela. And in 2007, there's kind of this expose done by somebody named Eva Gollinger, who's an attorney, a Venezuelan-American attorney. And she writes this book, Bush versus Chavez, Washington's War on Venezuela. And she specifically flags the role of Sharp and the Albert Einstein Institution in training anti-Chavez activists. And, many of them, and this is not uncommon, and if you look at who Sharp and his colleagues train, many of them being on the far right. So this kind of, the dam starts to break and accusations start to compound. And so, Chavez himself gets on Venezuelan TV and, accuses Sharp of stirring unrest. The Asia Times does this kind of, expose on Sharp. Ahmadinejad's Ministry of Propaganda releases this kind of, hokey conspiratorial video of Gene Sharp and George Soros and John McCain all conspiring in the White House against Iran. And so there's this moment of sort of who is this guy? And, nobody's really ever heard of him. He's not dinner table conversation. And in fact, he's been called, the most important political figure you've never heard of. And in response, there is a kind of concerted pushback. And there's this letter, which you can easily find online, issued in 2008 from Sharp's, supporters who are saying, no, Sharp, has never aided the project of U.S. empire. People like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn sign on to the letter. The letter makes a number of pretty, easily falsifiable claims. One of which is, they say that AEI's financial flows are clean of government money, except for receiving a little bit of, money for one-time grants from the National Endowment for Democracy and the International Republican Institute to translate some stuff. They've never received any money. And you can just look at AEI's own annual reports and see that that's false. So, but this letter kind of, turns the volume down on any debate and anybody really since who, has attempted to challenge the kind of pat public story about Sharp has been, pretty quickly labeled, a dictator, apologist, and a conspiracy theorist. So yeah, that's kind of how we get to the global South, and we can, I assume you'll probably want to get into, what this looks like in the global North proper as well, namely the U.S., because that's a big part of the story too.
That's where I do want to turn, but I also did want to ask, it's curious, as you, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but, you had said he's a complex figure, and I understand what you're saying. I think too often we reduce people to, good or evil. But based on your description of his impact overseas, it does sound very much like he was a instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Is that oversimplifying?
So the word instrument is interesting because it implies a level of control that is complicated and not necessarily always present. And so it's something that has to be parsed pretty carefully. So actually, interestingly, in 1968, the CIA at Harvard, where Sharp was stationed, and actually he would publish his dissertation that year. So, 1968 is a pretty crazy year, right? And the CIA at Harvard itself came under very, very intense scrutiny, and there were lots of very militant protests targeting the CIA at Harvard. The center would eventually get bombed. There were a number of times activists sort of basically, ran in and sort of destroyed, the files and overturned tables and, put graffiti on the walls and so on and so forth. A number of times that happened, and just, lots of very aggressive protests that were basically saying, look, the CIA at Harvard is an imperialist front. It's home to the architects of the Vietnam War. Even like the kind of official historian of the center has to concede, these accusations kind of hit pretty close to home because a lot of these people were architects of the Vietnam War. George Bundy, was one of the biggest champions of carpet bombing North Vietnam. So in these protests, activists actually uncover these notes from something called the Bissell meeting. Richard Bissell was on staff at the CIA and important. I believe he was in the Deputy Directorate of Plans, but I can't remember that 100%. But anyhow, the Center for International Affairs had been at this meeting convened by the CIA, and these notes reveal the most complete description of the CIA's covert action strategy and tactics ever made available to the outside world. And what the notes say is that there's been a number of kind of exposés in the 60s, like the CIA is exposed for funding the National Student Association, for example. I believe it's Ramparts magazine kind of breaks that story. And there are a few other big kind of exposés of these, CIA direct funding, supposedly, popular movements, popular organizations. And so in response to this problem, the CIA is going to now have to make use of private institutions on an expanding scale. And this is, taken directly from the notes, what I'm saying here. Though those relations which have been blown, the notes say, cannot be resurrected. We need to operate under deeper cover with increased attention to the use of cutouts, i.e. intermediaries. The CIA's interface with the rest of the world needs to be better protected. So, part of what is being described here is a shift, from these kind of direct relationships to a kind of intelligent strategy that's going to necessarily be a little bit harder to prove. It's going to be harder to prove that the CIA is, quote unquote, behind anything, right? And That's the CIA itself, saying that this is what we're going to have to do. We need, to get rid of all these smoking guns. So, given that this is the shift that the CIA is making, and continues to inform CIA strategy, it is very difficult to say, I think, that Gene Sharp was an instrument in any kind of technical sense of, the intelligence community. But was he ideologically aligned? Yes. Was his programs aligned? Yes. Did his activities advance the interests of the United States? Yes. The interest being, construed as the interest of those in the intelligence community, yes. But I think it's a good question because I think that's been one of the stumbling blocks in understanding Sharp is, it's dangerous to be too didactic in describing the nature of his relationship to the state because it's grounds to get easily dismissed. It's like, because there is no evidence he was on, payroll of the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, which is a very important soft power organ that is started in 1983 and is charged with doing a lot of what the CIA did in the 60s and 70s. It, funds the Albert Einstein Institution, but so do, lots of other foundations, right? So it's not, you can't say that AEI was purely an NED pass-through. So the picture that emerges is one of, key foundations, the National Endowment for Democracy, key intelligence organs, Robert Helvey, for example, again, with his defense intelligence, longstanding defense intelligence relationships, all kind of being in conversation with one another, but there seems to be a very deliberate, very careful management of the formal boundaries between everything.
In the time we've got left with you, I wanted to talk about, in the second part of your essay, you do a fabulous breakdown of the mechanics of this revolutionary nonviolence philosophy in practice and what it does to activism and the impacts that it is having on protest movements today that we're seeing in the streets. And I think that kind of the first interesting point of departure is you juxtapose what nonviolent revolutionary theory says about the state with what was the Marxist and also somewhat kind of the American anarchist analysis of the state. I mean, there's, for all intents and purposes, anarchism in America is defined by having, at least as a gateway drug entry into that philosophy, Noam Chomsky, who's got a very nuanced approach to what exactly the state and revolutionary struggle should be like.
Yes. Yeah, very important question. So the difference comes down to this. Do we take the state over, or do we collapse the state? So Gene Sharp's worldview is kind of sort of like a morality ethic, between good and evil. And this is the case for most Cold Warriors, actually. Most kind of high Cold War liberals see themselves engaged. And World War II and Nazism kind of also inform this pretty powerfully. We see ourselves as braced in this fight against evil. And it's a very religious kind of worldview. And for Sharp, violence is the great evil. And it's kind of the key, in Marxist terms, we would say kind of the key contradiction. Not class conflict, not the tension between those who own and those who work, but violence is the key contradictions that we're trying to transcend. And so Sharp is on the side of the angels and so wants to get rid of violence. And for him, the key vector of violence is what he describes as the centralized state. And what is the centralized state? Very tellingly, he does not point to the presence of secret police and suspension of habeas corpus and all of this. What he points to is the government's involvement, relative involvement in the economy. So does the government own things? Is there a lot of public ownership? Are there regulations? What are taxes like, et cetera? And Sharp does not say very much about political economy. He's not an economist, but it's clear that there's a political economy kind of lingering in the shadows of his work that is consistent with, call it neoliberalism, libertarianism. There are important distinctions between those things, but, Sharp's political economy is vague enough that we can sort of locate him in a few traditions. But his ideas are gaining steam at the moment of the neoliberal turn, right, which is trying to attack and dismantle this New Deal, quote unquote, centralized state. And so this is a pretty significant departure from revolutionary theories of the 19th and early 20th century, which say, no, the working class is trying to take over the state. We don't want to decentralize the state. We don't want to collapse the state. The motion is different. The motion is we want to take it over. And in fact, in some instances, we want to centralize it further. We want the state to expropriate. We want to, shift the nature of ownership from one of bourgeois private property to collective public ownership, right, which is a centralizing motion. So it's a very different revolutionary vision. And we see when, Sharp, we'll get into his work in the United States in a moment, but he is an important kind of intellectual pivot for an organization called the Movement for a New Society that starts here in the United States in the 70s and is dedicated to bringing about nonviolent revolution. We see in that organization a great kind of microcosm of that conflict between the revolutionary visions, between Gene Sharp's idea of, what we need is to really decentralize the state. The kind of implication is that if we really wanted a perfectly nonviolent world, we just wouldn't have the state, which, as I get into in the piece, misunderstands, I think, in a pretty profound way, what a state is. That versus, the Marxist and perhaps in certain, veins of anarchism, also the case that the state being the football, the thing we're trying to capture and use to advance, our political aims.
Yeah, you point out how there's a very strange conflation of domination and violence in a way that it basically determines as evil not just, the authoritarian aspects of the state, but also like the welfare state and the functions of democracy that we actually do kind of need to have in place in some form to prevent complete human civilization collapse. Yeah, and which all societies feature, be they capitalist or something else. So, obviously, since violence is such an important concept for Sharp, I spend a lot of time in both part one and part two trying to suss out what exactly he means by that. And, violence is a very pesky term to try to define, actually. And what's clear is that the way he constructs violence is kind of, an inch deep but a mile wide. So he requires that in order for something to constitute violence, the injury that's been inflicted has to have been direct. So indirect injuries, like injuries inflicted by, for example, market forces,
don't really constitute violence because they're indirect. But on the other hand, the way that he constructs what an injury is really, really broad. And so there's a way in which, the construction is also a mile wide, an inch deep, but a mile wide. And in this construction of violence, this mile wide kind of construction, you see domination, like you said, getting kind of associated with violence in a way that constitutes really a slippage. It's like the distinction between these two concepts sort of disappears, and things like hierarchy, inequality are effectively rendered the same, kind of equivalent to violence. And like you said, what makes that problematic is that when we talk about violence, the implication is that there's something antisocial about it, right? That, maybe there are instances in which violence is justified, but typically, the reason we have to make that clarification it's justified is because violence on its own isn't justified. There's something illegitimate about it. Whereas, as I point out in part 2, domination is something that is much more complicated, right? I mean, you can say that if, as I say in the piece, forcing second homeowners on the coast to submit to wind farms that obstruct their vistas and, reduce their property values, that's a form of domination, right? Taking taxes, right? And using them to pay for Medicare for all and, K-12 public education. That's a form of domination. And the people who are being dominated, namely the rich, don't like it very much. And so when domination gets pathologized as violence, we start to run into, I describe it as a kind of domination anxiety. People start to feel bad about their political agency and their potential political willpower. And there's all kinds of entropic effects within internal political culture that we see within for a new society that I chart out in part 2. So both internally, in terms of political culture, and then also in terms of political vision and political program, this domination anxiety, which I think is really hard to extricate from Sharp's worldview. The term that is discussed more in part 2 is revolutionary nonviolence. This is kind of the ideology that Sharp's ideas kind of help offer scientific legitimation for. And it's not a very often named ideology, but it is pretty hegemonic, I'd say, within U.S. social movements. And yeah, it really vexes us because, one expression of it is consensus decision-making, right? Because we don't want to state anybody by forcing people to accept decisions that they don't agree with, and I think probably most of your listeners are familiar with the dysfunctions that flow from that.
Could you elaborate further on consensus method? Because I think that was a very fascinating topic for your writing.
Yeah, so, Movement for a New Society, like I said, is this organization that started in the 70s by mostly Quakers who are really engaged in anti-war activism. And one of their key founders is this fellow named George Lakey, who is a kind of mentee of Gene Sharp's. And this organization is, it's a network of activists across the country, which is trying to bring about a nonviolent revolution. And the key ways that they're trying to do this are through kind of the internal work that they're doing. They are important kind of innovators of activists, not to be crude, but kind of working on their own shit, so kind of the self-work, which could, and I'm not the only one to have observed this, could teeter on the kind of cult-like. But then also through training movements. They do a lot of training, and pedagogically this is very different from like political education, which have been more in the socialist or anarchist tradition. So they're training people in, number one, Gene Sharp's ideas, and they train lots of movements in the 70s, 80s, and then after M&S dissolves, its members create new organizations that keep training. So they trained lots and lots of movements across the U.S. in Sharp's ideas, the methods of nonviolent action. And they also do a lot of training in democratic group process, i.e. consensus decision-making, which is a procedure whereby no decision or action can occur until everybody in the group decides that they agree with it, which is supposed to be a really empowering form. And I mean, to be clear, I have inflicted consensus on lots of long-suffering comrades, as I say in the piece. So I'm very intimately familiar with how this goes down. Everybody's very optimistic. It's like, this is a great idea. Everybody is going to, get a say. No one's voice is going to be, neutralized, whatever. But it turns out to be a conservative influence. And the Movement for a New Society itself, its alumni, recognize this and are very candid. There's this little book, Oppose and Propose by Andrew Cornell, which is a kind of biography of the organization. And they're very clear that, consensus thwarted them, because it means that, on the one hand, it takes a very, very long time to do anything. It creates a kind of middle class or upper class composition to your organization because working people do not have time to sit through consensus process. It tends to be an influence that makes outcomes more conservative because you're constrained by the lowest common denominator. And then antisocial elements can hijack the process and just for fun, object and, make everybody mad. So all these things are going on. And George Lakey himself says, maybe but for consensus, we would still be around. And again, I mean, it seems like it's just procedure, but actually it's highly ideological. There's a political lesson that's being transmitted in the use of consensus, which is that it is bad, it is violent to have a process wherein some people don't get their way, that some people are dominated by the group and are forced to go along with a plan that they don't like. When in fact, in real life, this is something that is a necessary feature of group existence. We do not always get our way.
I think it's fair just to acknowledge this emerges also at the time when the Marxist-Leninist formations of various flavors at the time. I mean, democratic centralism within the Marxist-Leninist tradition had such a sour taste for so many people after so many years, and I think it's fair to acknowledge that, but it also had its own domination because of leadership issues, right?
Definitely. No, absolutely. I mean, this is, I think that it's important to realize the contradictions, throughout this story, which is, I mean, personally, I think that any sort of utopian imaginings can maybe give us energy, to slog through the grueling, daily, kind of daily work of politics. But I mean, in terms of reality, I mean, utopian vision can be pretty dangerous. And so, whether it's the vision of, a perfectly unified, global communism, I'm skeptical that level of unity is really possible or desirable. When I think about the kind of technical requirements of what that would entail, there are some big problems there, But on the other hand, ironically, the utopian vision of a world free of domination, it kind of ends up getting you in a very similar place. George Lakey, again, one of the founders of Movement for a New Society and one of Gene Sharp's mentees, and a very important kind of thinker in the revolutionary nonviolence tradition. He wrote basically a primer on revolutionary nonviolence, the five stages of nonviolent revolution, and he the book kind of culminates in a vision that, despite his clear anxiety about domination and wanting a kind of nonviolent, wanting nonviolent social relations to animate everything, the ultimate revolutionary vision is a kind of expert-driven world state. And he doesn't really answer, like, okay, well, how do the decisions of this expert-driven world state get enforced? And he's like, his, I think, exact language is, it's an awkward question, because, yes, coercion and domination is an awkward question. And I think that there's a way, we just kind of don't escape these problems in a certain way. The current title of his book is Toward a Living Revolution, a 5-stage framework for creating radical social change.
But I wanted to definitely ask you about the implications of all this for Black Lives Matter, and which, because of all the protests that have been going on, you say in your piece that Sharp had a dramatic impact on the protest left, and you say that you say that the protest left. You're talking about, and I'm just reading from your piece. I am talking about that milieu of relatively recent origin that focuses on fomenting, training, and growing nonviolent social movements. And you say its politics tend, though this is changing, to be concerned with good and bad rather than interest. Though it has a revolutionary elan and invokes people power, the protest left has a middle-class character and tends to be grounded in institutions like nonprofits and the foundations that finance them, rather than, for example, labor unions. So, how do you see Black Lives Matter fitting into this here? I mean, would you consider that to be part of the protest left? And how is it obviously has to do more with, his impact also has to do with the United States itself. I mean, we don't have powerful labor unions the way most European countries do. And I'm wondering if that's part of the way the protest left develops as well.
Can I buttress that with just one further point? Is over the past 5 years, I've been reading really great Black journalists like the late Bruce Dixon, Glenn Ford, both from Black Agenda Report, and John Jeter, and they've actually touched on a lot of the things that come into this question about the difference between state-level chapters and the national organization of Black Lives Matter, and there's a clear base and superstructure lesson inscribed into the way those things interact with each other.
Yeah. So I've been, a Black Lives Matter kind of foot soldier, but I've not been involved in, I have not been involved very deeply in that movement. So this is all just interpretation from reporting. But I think that what we see in Black Lives Matter is similar to what we see in something like the climate movement, which is that protest politics are a field of struggle, just like other political means, like voting, right? I mean, so there are different tendencies, I think, within Black Lives Matter that are trying to do different things. And I do think that, though I don't really get into it in either part one or part two, I do think that there's an important relationship between Sharp's politics of nonviolent action and the rise of what people refer to as the nonprofit industrial complex, but specifically that part of the nonprofit industrial complex that deals with political advocacy and social movement building. Because Gene Sharp's politics of nonviolent action, strategic nonviolence, revolutionary nonviolence, has a very different class politics that labor unions do, that socialists do, Marxists, anarchists typically do. I mean, but Marxists certainly do. And those class politics are much more comfortable for foundations like the Ford Foundation to fund. Listeners can read more about the class politics and movement for a new society and for Gene Sharp in the essays, but the short story is that movement for a new society, for example, because they're kind of anxious about domination, don't like the idea of the working class dominating the owning class. They are much more interested in building cross-class movements, wherein class prejudices are dealt with. So mocking rednecks for their accents, right? And I say that as a Kentuckian, so inside the culture. Making fun of poor people because they have bad teeth. This is kind of a prejudice that needs to be, dealt with internally, as opposed to, no, what needs to happen is, the bourgeoisie needs to be expropriated, right? That's not the vision of class transformation that revolutionary nonviolence has. And so an organization like the Ford Foundation, they like the idea of a cross-class movement. And that's a kind of very pivotal and unique idea that comes out of this revolutionary nonviolence tradition. So those elements of Black Lives Matter, and I think these elements probably get, a lot of attention because of their situation and how they're situated and their access. Those elements which are funded by foundations in substantial part answer to those foundations and are using ideas that are compatible with that foundation funding. And that's not rocket science. But of course, there are very real, not politically invented, but very real political grievances that animate this movement. Just as is the case with the climate movement or the movement against mass incarceration or the movement, to change U.S. immigration policy, et cetera, et cetera. These are real issues. The question becomes, okay, people get angry, they get mobilized, they want to take action, to whom do they turn, right? And like you pointed out, we have a very weak labor movement in this country, and that's not an accident. There has been very deliberate efforts to destroy that labor movement because militant labor actions were key to driving and creating the political space necessary for the New Deal, which, our ruling class is largely in agreement, was taxing the rich too much and, empowering workers too much and needed to be gotten rid of. So, it's not simply the pathologies of the U.S. working class that explain why the labor movement is weak. It's that, it's been getting hammered, while meanwhile, very, very savvy, you have to give them credit, very savvy, ideologically clear foundations have been funding a kind of alternative left that has this very different class vision. And people who get activated, myself, for example, when I started to get involved in climate issues, we turn to what ideas and resources and organizations are available, and it's largely nonprofits that answer to foundations that rarely have robust membership structures, i.e. are very rarely democratic, offering strategic nonviolence and revolutionary nonviolence. So, I think, to be, I don't know how these protests, none of us do. None of us know how these protests are going to end up. But, the challenge, I think, right now is to improve what ideas are available for, American workers as they get very fairly angrier and angrier about what has happened to the United States since the neoliberal turn, and give them better ideas for how to change course and how things might be different. Because, of course, the ultimate measure is always in the material realm. That's where we know whether we've won or not. But ideas are a very important terrain of struggle. Obviously, you all are, doing that with Washington Babylon. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to engage in that struggle over ideas and try to give activists better ideas that they can work with. And, I think it's important to see all of this as a historical phenomenon with multiple fronts. And similarly, given the situation we're in today, there's not going to be any sort of silver bullet. I did a recent interview and somebody was like, what do we do? What do we do now? How do we fix it? Beyond just raising awareness. And I'm like, raising awareness about, Sharp's full complexity and the limits of revolutionary nonviolence, it seems kind of inadequate, but actually ideas are really powerful. And we have to trust that people equipped with good ideas, are capable of really great things. So trying to turn back the losses of the past several decades is not going to be some sort of simple, now we understand who Gene Sharp is, and now it's going to be easy to, fix our political strategy and fix our political culture on the left, and we can sort of get the show back on the road. It's I don't think going to be as easy as that. When Hayek and company, when the early neoliberals sort of assessed their situation in the 30s and 40s, they realized that it was going to be a multi-generational project to try to get the world back on their, right wing, back on the right wing track, and they planned accordingly. They built institutions that were capable of enduring over generations, right? And I think one of the ticks that has come out of revolutionary nonviolence and Sharp's ideas is, this kind of instrumentalization of protest, where it's like, we just need a protest. This is a quick fix, If we just, get 3% of the population in the streets, we can overthrow the dictator and everything is going to be better. And obviously, it's just not so simple as that. But, people who are desperate, young people, are vulnerable to offerings like that, right? But I think that we do need to push back and say, no, the problems that we're dealing with are multifaceted, they're complex, the sources are various, and so we need to dig in for a few generations here. It's gonna take a while to cure this, if that's what we're interested in.
Boy, a few generations, that's a scary thought. But
I know, it is a scary thought. Climate change, obviously, that's where I sort of come to this topic from, and we, you could argue we don't have a few generations, right? But
that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, but I think that history, because of the communications technologies that we have available to us, history is, I would argue, being accelerated. It's being compressed. So the dialectic is speeding up, So
right.
what perhaps could take, literal generations 100 years ago, maybe we can make things move a little quicker today. But with speed comes increased danger. So it requires much more savvy, I think, and precision, given this accelerated historical phase that we're entering. But I do think, simply approaching what I'm describing as kind of a question of durability. Are the ideas we're using durable? Are the institutions we're building durable? Because even if, we don't have a lot of time, so we have to move quicker, okay, nevertheless, that pressure is going to be really intense. So we need to make sure, as my kind of metaphor from the end of the essay suggests, it's like we need to kick the tires because we need to know whether the tires are going to take us the distance.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon Podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.